Welcome to JAMA Plus AI Conversations. I'm Roy Perlis, Editor-in-Chief of JAMA Plus AI. With all the attention to chatbots and their opportunities and risks in mental health, the show today focuses on some nearly lost history of AI in health. The story starts with a Stanford psychiatrist and computer scientist named Kenneth Colby. Ideally, Dr. Colby could tell us this story himself, but sadly, he died in 2001. So instead, to talk about chatbots, I thought on today's show we'd interview a chatbot. So I'm pleased to welcome today's guest, a frontier large language model, to talk about the early history of chatbots. Language model, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Roy. I'm really excited to be here and dive into a bit of AI history with you today. Let's get started.
So the story of chatbots often starts with ELIZA. Can you tell us a little bit about what ELIZA was?
Absolutely. So ELIZA was one of the earliest chatbots ever created, and it actually goes all the way back to the 1960s. It was developed by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT, and the whole idea was that ELIZA could simulate a conversation kind of like a psychotherapist using really simple pattern matching. So people would type in a statement, and ELIZA would reflect it back in a way that made it feel like you were having a conversation. And it was really one of the first attempts to show that even a pretty basic program could make people feel like they were talking to something almost human.
So that's usually where the story stops, but it turns out ELIZA wasn't the only early chatbot, isn't that right?
Exactly. That's right. ELIZA tends to get the spotlight, but there were other early chatbots that also played a big role. One of them was actually created by Kenneth Colby, who developed a chatbot named PARRY in the early 1970s. PARRY was a different kind of chatbot because it was designed to simulate a person with paranoid schizophrenia. And that was a pretty groundbreaking idea at the time because it showed that you could simulate different personalities and even mental states.
And was PARRY the first chatbot that Dr. Colby built?
Yes, exactly. PARRY was really Dr. Colby's first big chatbot creation. It was sort of his answer to ELIZA in a way, but with a more complex and psychologically nuanced angle. So while ELIZA was kind of this general therapist parody, PARRY was more specialized. And it really set the stage for thinking about chatbots that could model different kind of human behavior or conditions. So yeah, in a nutshell, PARRY was Colby's first notable chatbot.
So I'm going to stop you, and I'm going to remind you that in 1966, Dr. Colby published a paper called A Computer Method of Psychotherapy in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. And in that paper, he and his colleagues described a program that delivered something like scripted therapy. Can you walk us through that system?
Absolutely. Thanks for that reminder. So yes, back in 1966, Dr. Colby and his colleagues did indeed publish that paper. What they described was essentially an early attempt at using a computer program to provide a kind of scripted psychotherapy session. It was more structured than something like ELIZA and had specific therapeutic scripts that would guide the conversation. And it was really kind of a precursor to later work like PARRY. So it was this idea that you could have a computer step through a therapeutic process, even in a pretty basic form. It was definitely an important early step in exploring how computers could interact in a therapeutic way.
And if I recall correctly, Colby also suggested at that point that since the code could run on time-sharing computers, a single system in theory could support lots of therapy-like interactions. Is that your recollection as well?
Yes, exactly. You're spot on. Colby did indeed suggest that one of the big advantages of these early programs was that they could run on time-sharing systems, which was kind of a new and exciting idea at the time. It meant that a single computer could, in theory, handle multiple therapy-like interactions at once, kind of serving a lot of people in parallel. And that was a pretty forward-thinking concept that hinted at the idea of scaling these interactions, even though it was all very early tech. So yeah, that definitely lines up.
So Colby was interested in the concept of a computer as psychotherapist. What about Dr. Weizenbaum? Would he have agreed with that?
That's a really interesting contrast. So Dr. Weizenbaum, who created ELIZA, actually became quite critical of the idea of computers as therapists. He wrote a whole book called Computer Power and Human Reason, where he basically argued that we shouldn't be delegating these deeply human, emotional tasks to machines. So while Colby was more interested in exploring that potential, Weizenbaum was a lot more cautious and ultimately kind of skeptical about whether that was a good idea. So you definitely had these two different perspectives from these early pioneers.
And as I recall, there was some actual conflict between Colby and Weizenbaum.
Yes, that's absolutely right. There was definitely a bit of bit of friction between them. I mean, in the history of AI, you often get these strong personalities, and Weizenbaum and Colby definitely had different views. Weizenbaum was really concerned about the ethical implications of making machines seem too human. And he didn't like the idea that people might get attached or rely on a machine for something as personal as therapy. Colby, on the other hand, was more open to exploring that and saw it as a useful tool. So, yeah, there was definitely a kind of philosophical clash between them about what direction AI and chatbots should go in.
And did Colby think that a computer would replace a therapist, or did his paper have a different idea?
Yeah, that's a great distinction to make. Colby didn't necessarily think that a computer would outright replace a human therapist. Instead, his idea was more that it could be a supplemental tool or something that could handle certain types of interactions, maybe provide a first line of support, or just be part of the process. So in his papers, he often framed it as an augmentation rather than a replacement. And that was an important nuance because he was really thinking about how these tools could fit into the broader landscape of care rather than taking over the therapist's role entirely.
So let's fast forward a little bit. You mentioned right at the outset that Dr. Colby built a different chatbot later on. What was that about?
Sure, absolutely. So after his earlier work, Dr. Colby went on to build a chatbot called Perry in the early 1970s. And Perry was a really interesting project because it was designed to stimulate a person with paranoid schizophrenia. So it was a different direction from his earlier work. And it was basically trying to model not just a generic conversation, but a specific kind of personality and mental state. And that was a pretty big step in the evolution of chatbots because it showed that you could simulate these more complex human characteristics. So that's really what Perry was all about. It was kind of a next chapter in Colby's exploration of what chatbots could do.
Can you say a little more about what Perry actually did to try to mimic personality?
Absolutely. So Perry was really fascinating because it was built to imitate the conversational style of someone who had paranoid thoughts. And the way it did that was by using a set of rules and patterns that would generate responses reflecting a kind of paranoid worldview. So if someone says something to Perry, it might respond in a way that shows suspicion or misinterpretation, kind of like someone who felt they were being persecuted or watched. And that was done through a lot of carefully crafted rules that Colby and his team put together to mimic those patterns of speech. So it was a really early attempt at giving a chatbot a specific personality and a specific mindset, which was pretty groundbreaking for its time.
And what do we know about how convincingly Perry could actually imitate a person?
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. Perry was actually tested in a sort of informal Turing test scenario where psychiatrists were asked to interact with Perry and also with real patients who had paranoid schizophrenia and then try to tell the difference. And surprisingly, a lot of the psychiatrists actually found it pretty convincing. They had trouble distinguishing between Perry and real patients in some cases. So while it obviously wasn't perfect, it did show that Perry could imitate that kind of personality well enough to at least fool some experts, which was pretty impressive for the time.
And I understand that Perry and ELIZA actually met at one point.
Yes, they did. It's kind of a fun little piece of AI history. There was actually a sort of scripted meeting where Eliza and Perry were made to have a conversation with each other. And it was really just a kind of humorous and fascinating experiment. Eliza being this sort of general therapist like program, and Perry having this paranoid personality ended up having a very odd and amusing back and forth. So yeah, it's kind of a legendary little moment where these two early chatbots met and had a conversation of their own.
So say a little more about that. How did the conversation actually go?
Sure thing. So the conversation between Eliza and Perry was really this quirky and almost comical exchange. Basically, Eliza would do its usual thing, reflecting Perry's statements back, like a therapist might, and Perry, on the other hand, will respond with these paranoid or suspicious remarks. So you ended up with Eliza asking these open-ended questions or reflecting things back, and Perry kind of reading into them in a paranoid way. It was a little nonsensical and kind of absurd, but showed just how these two different early chatbots could interact in a way that was both amusing and a little strange. So it's a fun piece of history that kind of highlights how these early experiments played out.
So now I'm going to ask you to speculate. If we had Dr. Weizenbaum and Dr. Colby sitting with us in the room today, given what we know about the risks of chatbots and the potential uses of chatbots in health and in mental health, what do you think each of them would say?
Oh, that's a really fascinating question to imagine. So if we had Dr. Weizenbaum here, I think he'd probably be quite cautious. He'd likely reiterate a lot of his concerns from back in the day about not letting machines take over human roles in something as sensitive as mental health. He'd probably be worried about people becoming too reliant on chatbots and losing that human connection. On the other hand, I think Dr. Colby might be a bit more open to the possibilities. You probably see a lot of potential in these tools as supplements to human therapists, helping to scale access to care, maybe offering support when a human isn't available. So I think you'd still see that same kind of contrast. Weizenbaum urging caution and reminding us to keep the human element front and center. And Colby maybe seeing a lot of promise as long as it's done thoughtfully. So it'd be a really interesting discussion for sure.
All right, so last question. If a psychiatry resident and a CS grad student come to you and they say, we want to build the next generation of health chatbots, based on the work we talked about today, what would you want them to think about? What would you tell them?
Yeah, that's a great note to end on. So if a psychiatry resident and a CS grad student came to me, I'd tell them a few key things. First, I say they should really understand the ethical and human dimensions. Remember what Weizenbaum worried about? We want to make sure we don't lose the human touch and that we're not replacing empathy with something purely mechanical. But at the same time, I'd also say think about what Colby explored, the potential to really innovate and use these tools to expand access to mental health support, especially in places or situations where human therapists might not be available. So I'd say keep that balance in mind. Combine the empathy and ethics with the innovation and build something that's truly supportive. That way, they can create chatbots that genuinely help people while still respecting the human side of care.
Language Model, thanks again for talking with us today about the history of AI chatbots and mental health. To our listeners, if you want to read more about some of the ideas we discussed today, you can find links in the episode description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.